If you've been listening to the Energy Talks podcast, the last couple of episodes, I've been talking about a column I'm writing about the incumbency dilemma. What happens to, especially to large companies, when their markets and their technologies are disrupted, but they don't have an obvious pivot to another competitive business model? What do they do? How do they handle that? And I write about it in the context of the Alberta oil and gas industry. Well, imagine how delighted I was to discover that one of my favorite interviewees, Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon from the University of Calgary, has co-authored a School of Public Policy paper on this entitled Mission Impossible: The Influence of Incumbent Industries on Mission-Oriented Innovation Policy Targeting Carbon Lock-in. So welcome to the interview, Sara.
Great to be back.
Well, it is nice to have you back. It's been many months since we last talked, and we'll have to make sure that we don't go as long between interviews next time. But I'm really interested in this, and I guess I want to start this off, our conversation, with my take on this, and then you can tell me what you think about that and how that is consistent or isn't consistent with the argument you set out in this paper. So what I argue is that disrupted industries, they look for a pivot to a complementary business model. And I use the example of the auto industry, which when Tesla and now BYD and other Chinese manufacturers disrupted their industry with electric vehicles, they said, okay, look, an EV has an electric propulsion system. It has a battery. It has batteries, power electronics. It's not the automobiles that we're accustomed to, but it's still an automobile. And we can figure out how to make EVs and supply chains and so on. And the jury is still out as if all the legacy automakers are going to make the pivot, but certainly almost all of them are trying, and with varying levels of success. But if you look at the Alberta oil and gas industry, they have no obvious pivot. What's the pivot from oil and gas? Now, I've argued that in other places it could be into feedstock for advanced materials, but the industry doesn't see it like that. And what they've done instead is the other option available to an incumbent, which is to retrench in the status quo, to cut costs, to approach government for subsidies and other favorable policies and so on. And that, from my point of view, that explains the behavior of the Alberta's, particularly the oil sands companies in the last, say, 3, 4, 5 years. So that's my argument. Is that consistent with what you're talking about in the paper?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think one way that I would frame what you're talking about now is sort of as an example or a mechanism of carbon lock-in, which is part of the story that we get to, right? And so carbon lock-in is this well-studied phenomenon that is really a carbon-specific form of a more general, and I'll use a lot of academic-y words, but I'll come back and define them, of path dependency, which basically, in simple terms, just says that the decisions that we make in the past influence the choices that we have in the future. And there are different mechanisms through which that can happen. So, an obvious one is infrastructure. So if you build up a bunch of roads, or you build up a bunch of manufacturing infrastructure, that tends to keep you on that same path. You're going to have strong forces that are trying to make sure you make use of that. And if you want to make changes, it takes a lot of work to, take those things down and put other things in their place. And another mechanism of carbon lock-in, another way in which we see our high carbon systems stay entrenched, is really through political power that in certain groups, and certainly incumbent interests, have. And so, I think it's I would argue that it's, the literature really explores, I think, quite well the idea that certainly fossil fuel incumbents have been, and by all accounts are continuing to use that power, that political power they have, to try to delay a transition and maintain demand for their product. And so what we what we've done in this paper is sort of take that piece and say, okay, so here's what we know about carbon lock-in, And on the other hand, we have this growing call for the idea that, well, in order to break that lock-in, we need some kind of mission, right? And so the most famous missions that people maybe have heard of would be the Moonshot or the Manhattan Project. Sometimes even people call even for a climate mission or a Manhattan Project for climate. But a mission is really just a description of a kind of government innovation policy approach where the government, the state, defines some kind of goal and then supports that goal with significant funding throughout. And so what we're sort of looking at in this paper is really saying that these missions, they may well be a good way to address this carbon lock-in, but what's not being considered is how the power and influence that incumbents have comes into play in actually defining the missions. And that's a big problem if we're not paying attention to how that's happening. And I think we are seeing that happen. We have examples of that happening already today.
I'm a fan of economist Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about mission-oriented policies. And she brings up the case of the U.S. government, and it has the solar shot, the hydrogen shot. I mean, these aren't well known in Canada, but they're taking that approach, Mazzucato's approach, and they put it into the U.S. Department of Energy's, particularly into their portfolio. And is that the kind of approach that you're suggesting might be useful in Alberta?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm also, certainly very interested in mission innovation as an approach. And I mean, this paper, to give you sort of the history of it, came about based on, some realizations that I had while I was doing research for the previous work that I did, showing that, Aostra and the development of the oil sands in Alberta was really an example of mission innovation. And so the idea that, we could go down the path of the US, which is, had a lot of strong missions within, as you say, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense over, the history of the US has a lot of examples of mission innovation. And where the gap is, or where I think my co-author and I point out what's sort of missing in the conversation is there's a lot of attention paid to the way that missions can help sort of down the road. But there's much less attention paid to, are you actually even able to set up that mission in the first place? And what happens when at the beginning, at the starting line of your mission? There's other literature that we also discussed in the paper that shows that incumbents, they do, there are examples where they do respond, and in particular responding to things like renewables and others, when they start to threaten their market share directly. And really what we're arguing is that if you want to use this mission approach to address climate, that may well be a good thing to do, but we need to be more aware of the way incumbents will sort of shape what the mission itself is. And, I'm sure we'll get into that, but I mean, one of the missions that we hear, I think, often discussed in Alberta is this idea of, low carbon oil or low carbon fossil fuels. And so it's, is that the mission, or is the mission actually, Alberta producing its other resources, the lithium and other materials that exist in the ground? And it's really in that defining of the mission where incumbents come in. And the risk is that if you, sort of get it wrong, you can put a lot of money towards something that either, is sort of ends up not being the real solution, but is really more targeted at preventing, significant kind of loss in incumbent market share.
The issue of the reducing emissions, now, is that to make the industry more competitive in a low carbon market, or is it to combat climate change? Well, the industry, of course, argues that it's both, but really the emissions that the Alberta industry is targeting are scope 1 and 2. So their own emissions and those of their supply chain, but not scope 3, which is basically the turning of their feedstock into gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel, which then gets burned. And that's where 80% of the emissions come from. And none of them have, and no oil company really has a solution for scope 3 emissions yet. And so I would argue that the emissions reduction proposals that have been put forward by groups like Pathways Alliance for the oil sands producers is really about market competitiveness, not any kind of climate, response to the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. And I think it's, you see it in terms of, and that's kind of the missing piece in the whole conversation of the climate mission setting in Alberta, which is that if we are going to be successful in avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, we are going to, the world, the globe, are going to dramatically reduce our consumption of fossil fuel over the next, coming decades. And that piece is, as you say, I think very much missing from the core of the emission reduction plans that we see coming from the fossil fuel industry, which are very focused on those upstream emissions. Interestingly, and maybe this is a bit of an aside, but I always find it kind of interesting how quickly the dialogue or the kind of discussion around this has changed. I'm old enough, which is not that old, to remember when it was exactly the opposite, right? That the oil companies were very focused on talking all about how the majority of emissions came not from the production of the oil, but from the combustion, right? This argument of, well, we shouldn't, worry too much about the upstream emissions in the oil sands being higher because the majority of emissions come from the combustion. And now we have, a complete 180 where the industry is really focused on those upstream emissions because that's what they can control. And the Anglo community and kind of people focused on climate solutions are more focused on the full life cycle and downstream. And I think that really has come about exactly because we have seen a significant change in a short period of time of both sort of level of ambition, but also how quickly we are able to run on the technology side of actually, having a net zero emissions target, right? That was not really on people's radar, certainly 10 years ago, maybe even more recently than that. But that, coming back to the central point, that's really the big challenge of, if your mission is somehow compatible, if it is a climate mission, it has to be at the very least compatible with the idea that you're going to have dramatic reduction in consumption, and that's going to have big changes in terms of both who can actually be competitive, the total market size, and also the value of that market, and that's really missing completely from the conversation. And I think it's missing exactly for the kind of reasons that we talk about in the paper, which is if you look at historical missions, you simply don't find missions where a powerful incumbent industry was threatened, right? So aside from those famous ones that I mentioned, there are certainly really interesting examples of mission innovation in the pharmaceutical sector. But in that case, the benefits from those missions are either going directly to the same companies, so the same pharmaceutical producers, or at least they're sort of offsetting losses that would have happened otherwise. And the same is true within the agricultural sector. And in the paper, we look at a case study of Alberta, which is looking at the development of the oil sands. And we find similar evidence there that you really only had Aostra and the development of SAGD and the production of oil sands going forward when you reach the point that the conventional oil industry had started to decline. That is, you started to produce more conventional oil than you were finding, and there was a sort of general agreement and acknowledgement that this was happening. And only then did the conventional incumbents really remove their opposition. They didn't necessarily embrace it, but they removed their opposition to development of the oil sands. And you can see that both through their own communications with government, and then you also see it in government policies where you had a big shift from a time when the oil sands was in regulation or in legislation constrained to one where it was being pursued.
I want to talk about how the oil and gas companies in Alberta think about the energy transition, because they've made it very clear that they don't agree with the International Energy Agency and BP and Rystad and all of Bloomberg NEF, these organizations that are forecasting peak oil demand in between 2028 and 2030, and then decline in the early to mid 30s. Rather, they stick to, and sometimes outdated forecasts that actually show growth out to 2040 or 2050 in oil demand, global oil demand. Or they say, okay, that's fine, but we're going to be the last oil producer standing. And even in the IEA's net zero by 2050 scenario, there's still 25 million barrels a day of oil that's being consumed. We're going to supply that 25 million barrel market, and who knows whether they can do that or not. We haven't seen any modeling. Closest we've come is some recent Canadian energy regulator modeling for net zero. But it's what they've done is they essentially use that narrative to blunt any kind of policy aimed at reduction, whether it's at the federal government level and certainly at the provincial government level, because you hear Premier Danielle Smith, you hear Energy Minister Brian Jean echoing their narratives all the time. And so they've essentially almost captured the provincial government and using it as a shield to slow down any kind of policy from the federal government that will likely affect their output over the next, between now and 2050.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts there. I mean, I think one, the idea of an industry and an powerful incumbent industry being able to influence government. I mean, that very much is really that lever of political power that you see in lock-in. And again, certainly not unique to the oil and gas industry and not unique to Alberta, in that when you have a powerful incumbency, that does manage to influence government in all kinds of ways. When it comes to kind of the goal and what is trying to be achieved, I think there is we've heard a lot of language lately about the federal government trying to reduce production, right? Which is sort of, I would say, I don't know where this idea came from, but I think you can kind of see where the seed was planted to change what the government's actually doing, which is to talk about emissions into a production cap. But then coming back to kind of where you started with, what does future demand look like and where does Alberta sit and how competitive is it? As you said, right, you have increasingly number of different agencies and organizations that create scenarios for future oil demand, saying that, peak oil is coming. And there's a clear trend that peak oil is coming sooner and sooner as you kind of year by year, those forecasts shift. Recently you had the Chinese oil company itself saying that transportation oil demand in China, is basically peaking. So I think that while it was maybe debatable a few years ago where, how quickly this would happen and where we are in this transition, I think that the evidence is really starting to mount that indeed, electric vehicle adoption is happening at an increasing rate, and that is really consistent with the more aggressive scenarios for decline in demand for oil. And actually, if you go and look at the IEAs, they do this interesting analysis where they look at which sectors are on a path that is compatible with the net zero transition. And unfortunately, we have a long way to go on many sectors. But one that stands out as being compatible is actually electrification of personal transportation, which is a substantial source of demand for oil. So they're basically saying we are on a pathway to be net zero by 2050 when it comes to transportation. So all of these, really mounting evidence that we are very much on a pathway of declining demand for oil. And then the question, as you say, of, okay, so doesn't mean it's going to go to zero, who's going to end up being most competitive? And that's where the narrative starts to get a little bit, I think, muddled in terms of, certainly as a starting point, if the requirement to be a producer of choice in 2040, 2050 is to be low cost and low carbon, then Alberta has a challenge, right? Not because of we don't have good engineers, but because of the nature of the resource, being high carbon. And this is where I think that the industry is sort of trying to walk this fine line of saying, we are going to be the low cost, the low cost competitor, but we need, more than the tax credit. We need something like 75% support from the federal government to pay and provincial government to pay for the emissions reductions we need to do to get there. And that part I find very hard to square, of sort of, either you are going to be the low cost producer because you believe that you can, implement whatever it is, carbon capture and storage or electrification at a competitive price, or you're saying that you need substantial subsidies because you can't, but it sort of doesn't work both ways. Or if your argument is we're going to be the lowest cost producer because we're going to offload all of our costs onto the public, then that strikes me as not really a competitive business model, right? You're really basically just asking for the Canadian public to subsidize production for you. And so that's where it all sort of, I think, starts the case for it starts to fall apart. But it is all very consistent, on the other hand, with this framework of saying that an industry will look for support in technology development for technologies that enable, that don't disrupt its market share, right? And so I think that's very much what we see happening, and very much the risk that I see is that this climate mission or climate moonshot gets co-opted into significant public funds flowing into an area that's unlikely to end up being highly profitable at the end of the day.
In my column, I'm going to be exploring a related dilemma, the disruption dilemma, and that is, the disruption dilemma. So the question becomes, when the incumbent is disrupted and they thinking about a response, how do they innovate? Do they innovate inside the company? Like, do they set up a skunk works to develop new technologies and processes or services? Do they invest in startups that they eventually might buy? For instance, we saw Occidental Petroleum down in the States buy the Canadian-based carbon engineering company, which is an example of that kind of strategy. And I argue in the column that the Canadian oil and gas industry is fantastic at innovating inside the box. If you want to solve a production problem in the oil sands or conventional oil, you can set loose a bunch of Canadian engineers, and by God, they will come up with a solution. They're very good at that, brilliant at that. They're not very good at innovating outside of the box. And you see that most of the innovation is coming from places like Alberta Innovates, the provincial innovation agency. And the conclusion I come to is that Alberta should stop looking for innovation around oil and gas. We should stop looking to the companies. They're not going to do it. Their history is not in that, shouldn't suggest it. They aren't doing anything now. They're pulling back from any innovation that they might have done. Suncor's getting out of the energy transition businesses that it had invested in. And I'm arguing that the government, the business community should set up these mission-oriented policies that you're talking about and these projects, and they should go ahead and innovate. And when the time comes, they'll just tell the oil companies, we've developed a domestic market here, and now we need you to sell your oil and gas to these industries as feedstock instead of maybe, American refineries. Because innovation ain't coming from the companies. That would be a mistake, but it's one that the companies are happy to have policymakers make because it's in their interests.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think I wouldn't single out the oil industry or the Albertan oil industry as facing challenges in innovating and responding to disruption, right? I mean, I think, again, you're describing something that the majority of industries face, and the whole kind of idea behind the logic of mission innovation is that a lot of these really dramatic innovation steps don't come from within companies. They obviously get, and it can go back to the oil sands example in SAGD, they get, once they're developed and sort of shown or proven at some level, they then maybe get nurtured and grown within companies. But that the first dramatic steps happen elsewhere. And I mean, I think there's a very understandable risk reward kind of profile there. We know all the challenges with the idea that, companies can't capture the full value of innovation and R&D expenditure that they are making. So these are all sort of things that are not, I think I agree with them. I don't think they are, they shouldn't be taken as like, negatives or that there's something wrong with this industry. Like, this is just sort of the way that we see where we see innovations come from. And I mean, similarly, when it comes to responding, I think we're seeing oil companies in Alberta responding to some extent to pressure from shareholders when it comes to where they want to see the company's focus. And you mentioned kind of a step away from energy transition. And I think, again, it seems to me to be a very logical conclusion, right? If I was an investor in an oil company, I'm making that choice because of the business that they are in and what they have to offer, which is oil production and the returns that go along with that, particularly during what I think is going to be a bumpy period of transition as we're seeing. Where you have mismatches between supply and demand, is kind of all the rules and things we thought we knew about oil growth go out the window. But if I want to invest in a clean tech company, then I'll invest in a clean tech company. And again, I think that's not unique when it comes to other sectors, even in energy, where a lot of the kind of successful developers of renewable energy, didn't necessarily come from the incumbent, fossil generation space. Again, because I think it's a very hard sell to investors to kind of say that you're going to do both things. You have to have some really competitive advantage that you think that you can, transfer over to that other space. And I mean, even companies, even very large multinational energy companies are sort of moving away from that space. And I think they have, somewhat more of a credible story to say that, well, maybe they have some competitive advantage through their, international networks and experience operating in these different regions that they might be the leaders there. So I think it's sort of, all very internally consistent, I guess, what we see happening. And I just lost my train of thought where we started, but yeah, so comes back to, again, this point of the extent to which you want to have mission innovation happening. You need to really think carefully about whose mission you're pursuing, right? And who is focused more on the shorter term, as they are very much incentivized to be by the market, versus on the 10, 20, 30-year time horizon that you expect disruptive innovations to really return fruit. It's same as what happened in the case of the oil sands, where you had the first SAGD tests were decades before the real explosive growth in the industry, and our companies are simply not set up and not incentivized to pursue that. And people have argued it's getting worse with the sort of short-term capitalism, but those are very long time scales to be thinking on.
So can we wrap up our conversation this way, Sara? Is that we agree that the Alberta oil and gas companies are facing the same pressures that oil companies are facing across the world. There's nothing new. And in fact, the responses to this are perfectly consistent with other oil companies and companies outside the industry. But if there are any lessons to be learned from previous incumbents that have been disrupted, is that there has to be at some point some innovation, and that where the incumbent can then re-engineer their business model. And you see, there aren't very many in the oil and gas space globally, but Equinor in Norway would be one. That was kind of a unicorn, where it's into hydrogen and wind farms and all sorts of things other than just oil and gas. But it's a model that others have tried, and like Shell and BP, and rejected and moved away from. So what lesson should we take away from this? It would sound like if there is not an innovation that happens outside the industry, that the Alberta companies can then incorporate somehow to make the pivot I talked about earlier, then they're basically riding the decline curve down into failure at some point.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to find much to disagree with that, and certainly I've seen that happen in other industries. And I think the Equinor one is an interesting example, where it's you have to have kind of the right mix of skills, but also some of these external factors that are certainly outside of the company's control. In that case, being in a place where you have the ability to pursue some of these other options. You have an offshore wind resource there. That's obviously not the case in our Alberta region. Not a lot of offshore wind in Alberta. But I think there are other things that one could look at, right, and talk about other resources that are underneath the ground, right? So things like lithium, things like other critical minerals that are part of the energy transition. I think those are the areas that are likely to be more fruitful. And they feel, I think they sound and feel very far away. And that's where I do think that, going back to kind of our history and the history of the Alberta oil industry is instructive, right? In terms of, there certainly was no embrace of the oil sands. And it was, although it's weird to kind of think that way today, because it is so much, not just part of the industry, but really dominates the oil industry in Alberta. But there was a time when that was really this, other, like, totally different thing and not sort of part of the industry as it is today. And so it's about, really trying to identify what are those, adjacent competencies or areas that, may one day, if you're successful, they may end up feeling like they were always part of what the resource sector did, arguably. But when it comes to the, policy side, that means that you need to have kind of strong leaders who are able to distance themselves or overcome some of these challenges in setting that mission, so that you actually have the time and space and investment that can go into developing those solutions, rather than the more near term. And there's examples from going back to the research and the case study, there were examples of a big push from the conventional oil industry for investment in enhanced oil recovery as sort of the answer to reverse the decline in production in Alberta. And there was some investment that did happen there, but it was dwarfed by the development of the oil sands. And so I think that's a very good parallel and sort of very similar type of story of, there's obviously a lot of pressure to pursue solutions that are going to be much closer to the business models of the current incumbents. And in order for government policy to ultimately be successful and to be a good steward and good use of public funds, it's about sort of overcoming or finding ways to direct those pressures. And I think, first of all, that just starts with that acknowledgement, right? So that when people start saying, let's have a climate moonshot, or let's have a Manhattan Project for climate, the next question is not just what should we do, but okay, and we know that there's going to be pressure to ensure that it is non-disruptive. And so how are we going to design our process, or how are we going to launch this mission defining process in a way that overcomes that challenge? And I think that's where we haven't really had that conversation to date.
There is a danger here. And the danger, aside from the ones that we've talked about already, the danger is not acting in a timely fashion. We have not got a lot of time, because if the scenario that I sketched out earlier, which is peak oil demand by 2028 or 2030 maybe, and then decline, you don't get immediate decline, you get a bit of a plateau, and then the decline begins. So somewhere around the mid 2030s is a good guess. It's a reasonable guess. So that really leaves, Alberta maybe 12 to 10 to 12 years, 13 years to do this. And this is like the metaphorical oil tanker. It does not turn on a dime. It takes a long time. We have to have the conversation you just said we're not having. Policy has to be put in place. They have to be implemented, on and on and on. It takes 15 to 20 years to really get this underway. And my concern is that if it doesn't happen soon, that it will just drag out, and it won't happen until it's obvious that decline has set in, and then it may be too late.
Yeah, I think that's the big concern, in terms of there's certainly no time to waste. And I think the shape of that decline and the implication on pricing are all a little bit open questions. And I think there is we're in a state now where I don't think there's a major expectation of significant new production, coming online. Right, there was a time when people were planning for dramatic oil sands expansion. I think we've sort of largely gotten to a point where people agree that that's not likely to happen, and so I think there is, we do have a little bit of time in terms of there being a window, even say during a period of decline, where there can be continued production, and as I said, I think there will be price volatility in that period. But certainly, yeah, the clock is ticking, and we need to start to reckon with these challenges. I definitely wouldn't write Alberta out, though, in terms of, we have a lot of resources and a lot of talent and skilled people, from both within the conventional energy sector and beyond. So I don't think it's by any stretch, game over. But it's certainly something that we, need to increasingly have that on. And I think it comes down to really just honest conversations, right? And honest looks at what those scenarios look like and what paths we're on, and making sure that we're, planning for that. And part of that, I think, has to come from the broader set of people in the province that are going to be impacted by this, right? And that's where you maybe start to see, certainly there's examples of missions that have been successfully created and supported through broad public support. And so I think that's one, potential pathway that we could see for a successful climate mission.
Well, Sara, you and your colleague have done a good job of ringing the bells, the alarm bells, in this paper. And I suspect it's going to take a lot more alarm bell ringing before we really get people's attention in Alberta, and particularly on the government and the political scene. But this is a good effort, and I've no doubt that we'll be chatting about this again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.